for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our online worship service. I am Carolyn Leap, the outgoing president of the board, and today our worship is led by the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, senior minister. He is joined by our assistant minister, the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, our music director, Mark Vogel, and our sanctuary choir. Dr. Bossen's sermon title is Kairos and Chronos. It is part of our month-long reflection on the theme of patience. Today, after the service, at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time, I would like to invite you to participate in our annual meeting. Information on how to join the meeting virtually, via Zoom, and additional materials for the meeting, like the annual report, were sent out in this morning's congregational email, and an overview reminder was sent out a day or two ago. Electronic voting will take place over the next week, but we need you at the meeting as well. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find our worship a source of comfort and clarity, and we invite you to join us each week for as long as we remain primarily online, and in person as soon as it is safe to gather again. I invite you now to hear our call to worship.
Welcome, you who long for connection, you who miss coming to this familiar place of gathering and worship, you who long for a familiar and loving place and have joined us online. Welcome, all those who have felt far too much and far too deeply this week. You who have felt anger, sadness, and grief over widespread illness and pandemic, over oppression, brutality, and murder. Welcome, those who have felt even a little joy, a bit of hope, a sense of wonder, spurred by those countless things in our world still beautiful, still awe-inspiring, and still wonderful. To those in these days of confusion who have felt they didn't know what to feel, welcome. Welcome to this familiar brick and mortar and virtual place of worship and gathering, to this place of the sound of voices raised in song. For this hour, reach out to those watching this morning and join hearts, if not hands. Raise your voices in song with them. Welcome, you who long for connection. Come, let us worship together.
justice in that land where I'm bound. Vamos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz.
Please join with me in the spirit that some call meditation and others name prayer. Make yourself comfortable. Relax. Take one deep breath and then another. Open your mind. Open your heart. Spirit of life and love, God of many names and mystery beyond all our naming. Today we name you the God of healing, the God who comforts the grieving, and the God who bestows patience when needed and impassions us with impatience when required. We name you as the God who comforts the mothers when their children cry out that they can't breathe. We name you as the God who strengthens the fathers who refuse to let their children experience the brutality that they have experienced. We name you as the God who comforts and strengthens the families of all those hurt and killed by violence, and all those who have fallen ill or have died because of the pandemic. We ask for persistence. We ask for wisdom. We do not ask for the strength to rebuild the world we had. We ask for the strength and insight to use what we have learned and build a better, more loving world. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. May the congregation, absent in body, though present in spirit, say Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. We lift up 3 of our community who are recovering from surgery: Natalie Brown, Diane Carroll, and Emily Wagner. I invite you now to say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
This is Today is our annual Inspiration Sunday. It's the 1 week a year when we take up an offering exclusively to sustain the life of our religious community. In future weeks, we'll be taking up a shared offering to support organizations in Houston that are working to address police brutality and support self-determination for the city's Black community. Today, however, our offering will help us to address significant and unplanned expenses in the life of our church. The first was the necessity to spend approximately $70,000 to repair our elevator. The second, the need to take on our fabulous producer, Christian Holmes, as a 3/4 time staff member so that during the course of the pandemic, we can continue to provide you with virtual worship services. I know that many of you will not be taking vacations this year because of the pandemic. And so, if you are able to, I want you to consider a bold ask. Think about what the congregation means to you, and think about giving First Church half of what you would spend on a vacation this year. And then next week, when we take up our shared offering to support organizations working here in Houston, think about giving the other half. Is that a lot to ask? Yes. Will it make a difference in sustaining a religious community committed to collective liberation? Absolutely. Will whatever you give this morning, whether it is $1 or $1,000, be greatly appreciated? Definitely. An offering to sustain the life of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston will now be gratefully received.
A reading from No Name in the Street by James Baldwin. One may see that the history, which is now indivisible from oneself, has been full of errors and excesses. But this is not the same thing as seeing that, for millions of people, this history, oneself, has been nothing but an incredible yoke, a stinking prison, a shrieking grave. It is not so easy to see that, for millions of people, life itself depends on the speediest possible demolition of this history, even if this means the leveling or the destruction of its heirs. And whatever this history may have given to the subjugated is of absolutely no value, since they have never been free to reject it. They will never even be able to assess it until they are free to take from it what they need, and to add to history the monumental fact of their presence.
Our second reading today is from Political Theology of the Earth, Our Planetary Emergency and the Struggle for a New Public by Catherine Keller. One thing was clear to me. This time in the life of the country is a Kairos time. Contemplating Trayvon Martin's murder, Kelly Brown Douglas concludes that Kairos is a decisive moment in history that potentially has far-reaching impact. It is often a chaotic period, a time of crisis. And then she adds, magnificently and as a theologian, that now time is a time pregnant with infinite possibilities for new life. The Kairos is still, and again, and ever, now. Might assemblage at the edge of chaos, deciding across critical difference, actually enact political inception? Or in the stupor of optimism and the closure of pessimism, do we rule it out? And with it, all the black-draped agonisms contracting present crisis with untold possibility. We owe each other everything. It all matters. What on earth is the matter with us?
There is a love
What I mean, my friends, is this: the time we live in will not last long. These words come down to us through the millennium from Paul. In the Christian New Testament, they are found in his first letter to the Corinthians. They bespeak a theological concept that might help us illuminate, understand, and ultimately act in these days of wonder, awe, and disruption. I'm speaking of Kairos. It's an ancient Greek word. The theologian Paul Tillich helpfully defines it as the right time, the time which something can be done. The right time, the time which something can be done, Kairos. One thing was clear to me. This time in the life of the country is Kairos time, observed the theologian Kelly Brown Douglas after the murder of Trayvon Martin. Brown Douglas wrote her words about an event that took place more than 8 years ago and published them in a book 5 years ago. She composed them right after the murder of Mike Brown and the beginning of the protests in Ferguson, the protests that launched Black Lives Matter as a movement. Kairos, the right time, the time in which something can be done. Trayvon Martin's murder did not prove to spark a Kairos moment. Mike Brown's murder did not foment one either. In the United States, in 2015, there were 994 people killed by the police. In 2016, there were 962 people. In 2017, there were 986. In 2018, there were 992. In 2019, there were 1,031. And thus far, in 2020, there have been 465. These numbers are all undercounts. The Washington Post, which keeps a running tally of the victims of police violence, only keeps track of police shootings. So Eric Garner's death at the hands of police in New York, or George Floyd's death at the hands of police in Minneapolis, are not included in these numbers. Kairos. Since George Floyd's death, at least 48 people have been killed by the police in the United States. 2 of them here in Texas. Such violence disproportionately impacts people with brown and black bodies. Native Americans are just under 3 times as likely to be killed by police as white people. African Americans are 2.5 times more likely, and Latinx people over 1.5 times more likely. The horror and outrage over these patterns has once again sparked global protests. Right now, people are mobilizing in the streets in ways that they haven't done in generations. Across the country, at least 10,000 people have been arrested during these protests. A police station was burned to the ground in Minneapolis. There have been pitched battles between protesters and federal forces in Washington, D.C., including the one that was launched to ensure that the president could have a photo op with a Bible outside of a church. An autonomous zone outside of both police and city control has been set up in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Houston, so far, has been spared such militant protests, a subject we will return to before the end of our sermon. These protests have engendered a national conversation about defunding or abolishing the police. And if you had told me 3 weeks ago that a major city was planning to abolish its police department, I would have stared at you with disbelief. And yet, this past Sunday, the Minneapolis City Council announced that it planned to do just that. Meanwhile, the New York Times is publishing op-eds by people like Miriam Kaba who believe, quote, "We can't reform the police," and instead are advocating the abolition of the police. Some of you, I am certain, oppose such measures. You, I imagine, might think that they are entirely unrealistic. You believe, I suspect, that society needs police to function. Others may have questions about such efforts. What will replace the police? How will communities be protected from violent crime? How will property be secured? These are complicated questions, and I'm not going to attempt to answer them in my sermon. I will, however, say in response 3 things about them before I return to the subject of Kairos. First, the defunding or abolition of police are not actions or policy decisions without precedent. Second, gun violence, or like gun violence, the kind of police violence that we experience here in the United States is not seen in similar constitutional democracies. Third, police violence, like the country's prison system, is deeply connected to the nation's systematic racism and white supremacist institutions. Abolishing or defunding the police. Such things have been done both abroad and in the United States. In Northern Ireland, for most of the 20th century, there was a long-standing pattern of police brutality and violence targeted at the country's Irish Catholics. For many Irish Catholics, the police had come to be seen as an occupied army aligned with the British government. By the time of the Good Friday Agreement, the event that brought an end to much of the political violence in Northern Ireland, the Royal Ulster Constabulary had lost the trust of most Irish Catholics. What was more, several RUC officers were linked to the activities of loyalist terrorists who opposed Northern Irish independence. In 2001, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was abolished and replaced with a new public safety force, with new procedures, new standards of accountability, less arms, and a new name, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Police violence plummeted. Today, the Police Service of Northern Ireland is viewed as a model for public safety throughout the European Union and has been called the EU's most accountable police force. For many years, Camden, New Jersey was one of the most violent cities in the country. It had one of the highest per capita murder rates. In 2013, the city decided that its approach to public safety was not working, and the city decided to disband its police force. Now, it didn't get rid of policing. It formed a new force with a different approach, made use of force a last resort. It abolished things like ticket writing quotas that often put officers at odds with civilians. And it replaced cruising through neighborhoods in squad cars with walking patrols. Afterwards, complaints against public security forces significantly decreased. But more importantly, the murder rate dropped by half. In 2017, crime in Camden was at its lowest point in 50 years. The approach that the city of Minneapolis is taking to disbanding its police department will probably follow these. The city council there is already talking about taking the funding it has been giving to the police and channeling it to mental health and addiction services. At the same time, it is discussing forming a new, smaller, and less heavily armed community policing service. Such steps probably do not go far enough for some police abolitionists. I'm sure some more radical solutions to the problems of public safety can be imagined and implemented. As Miriam Kaba admitted in her recent op-ed, many police abolitionists have a vision of a different society, built on cooperation instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. What would the country look like, she asks, if the billions of extra dollars were available to be spent on housing, food, and education for all, because the police had been defunded? Now, I'm not going to comment on whether having police of any kind is necessary. But what such efforts do suggest is that disbanding current police departments, ones with long-standing patterns of violence and brutality, and replacing them with something else has the potential to radically decrease the number of people who are killed by police in the United States, and that demands to defund or even abolish the police are not nearly as radical as some would have us believe. It's worth observing that the widespread killing of people by police officers is a phenomenon not witnessed in constitutional democracies with economies similar to those of the United States. In Germany, for example, less than 20 people were killed by police in 2019. In the United Kingdom, the number was only 3. In both Germany and the UK, police officers generally do not carry firearms. Special officers with special training are dispatched when they encounter someone who is armed. This brings me to my third observation about the abolition of policing. The police, like the prisons in the United States, are deeply linked to the country's history of white supremacy. Here in the South, police forces emerge from slave patrols organized by plantation owners to catch and return people who had run away from slavery. Since the end of slavery, police forces have often been deployed as almost occupying armies in communities of color. Michelle Alexander has detailed how, after the victories of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, police have been used alongside most of the rest of the criminal justice system to create a new Jim Crow and maintain white supremacy and the country's racial caste system. Reflecting on the role police play in the United States almost 40 years ago, James Baldwin chillingly observed, "The truth is that this country does not know what to do with its black population now that blacks are no longer a source of wealth, are no longer to be bought and sold and bred like cattle." The function of the police and prisons, he argued, was to answer this question by containing black people and maintaining what he and so many others have named the doctrine of white supremacy. Reflecting on this dynamic, Baldwin wrote, "I do not claim that everyone is innocent, but I do claim that the law, as it operates, is guilty, and prisoners, therefore, are all unjustly imprisoned." Baldwin wrote those words in 1972. He was reflecting on the trajectory of the civil rights movement and black power movements over the previous 2 decades. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., friends of his, had both been assassinated, as had Medgar Evers, another friend of his. In his text, No Name in the Street, he is oddly hopeful. For while he chronicles the deaths of members of the Black Panthers parties at the hands of police, trials, assassinations, funerals, and despair, and while he argues that for people of color, the history of this country has been, quote, "nothing but an incredible yoke, a stinking prison, a shrieking grave," he ends on a note of hope. An old world is dying, and a new one kicking in the belly of its mother. Time announces that it is ready to be born. Baldwin saw, in other words, the 60s as a Kairos moment, the right time, the time in which something might be done. Was it? Many of Baldwin's words are just as soberingly true today as they were 40 years ago. No doubt some of you disagree with them and with me for offering them to you, but the fact that they could be used to describe equally the dynamics of 2020 and 1972 is, to say the least, troubling. Kairos. Will the protests of the movements of today bring different results than the protests and movements of the 60s? Will whatever public security entity the Minneapolis city replaces its police force with behave differently than the police have there? Predicting the future is difficult and fraught. But in our predictions, we might turn to a consideration of another kind of time, Chronos. In the Christian theological tradition, Chronos is distinguished from Kairos. Again, I cite Paul Tillich. Kairos, the right time, the time in which something can be done, must be contrasted with Chronos, measured time or clock time. The former is quantitative, the latter is qualitative. Chronos is the calendar. Chronos is the day-to-day by which we live our lives. It is the fact that I get up every day around 7:30 in the morning and go to bed at about 11:30 at night. It's the reality that I have a standing staff meeting on Tuesday and another standing staff meeting on Thursday, that my son and I eat dinner together most nights around 8 p.m. and take a walk almost every day at the same time. That's Chronos. Ordinarily, we also use Chronos to structure our religious lives. This Sunday is our annual meeting, and typically it marks the end of the regular church year and the unofficial beginning of the summer season. And our religious community has a calendar by which it tends to function, by which time is supposed to flow, by which the ordinary quantitative march of time can be marked. We observe Christmas, New Year, Easter, Flower Communion, Ingathering Sunday, Earth Day, and the like, because they are part of the Chronos by which we order our lives. Now, of course, the pandemic has upended much of that. We changed our monthly themes for worship in May and June, picked patience, as Reverend Scott told you last week, because we thought it might be in short supply by now, and we might very well need to figure out how to be more patient. And now, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, that theme seems quaint. Kairos has again interrupted Chronos. Should I counsel patience when millions of people have been marching in the streets? Especially when there seems to be a direct correlation between the militancy of the protests and the gains made by protesters? Houston, I should note, is not a city where radical changes to policing are being considered. And while the mayor is to be applauded for his executive order to ban chokeholds, the city's most recent budget actually increases police funding. And City Council voted against a set of police reforms proposed by Council member Letitia Plummer the day after George Floyd's funeral. Is this because here in Houston, the mayor and police chief skillfully diffused what could have been militant demonstrations after the death of George Floyd? Now, please don't hear me calling for rioting on the streets. But what I do find myself wondering is what the consequences will be for the city if it doesn't seize on this moment of Kairos to reimagine policing. After all, at least 6 people have been killed by the police in Houston since the start of the year. What I mean, my friends, is this: the time we live in will not last long, said Paul. And while I began with my sermon with his words, they have proved to be some of the most wrong ever written in human history. Paul wrote them against the backdrop of a religious movement who thought that the apocalypse was imminent. Jesus had been crucified, killed as a common criminal, and the kingdom of God that he had preached had not arrived. Paul and the members of the early church thought he would return and bring with him an enduring reign of righteousness that would last forever, and that he might do so at any moment. In the same passage that I cited, Paul counsels for, "Let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and for those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and for those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it." Paul and his friends thought, in other words, that Kairos was going to erupt at any moment and interrupt Chronos forever, and that ordinary time would cease and the new millennium would arrive. And while it might be coming, his predictions of an imminent shift in his society proved even more wrong than James Baldwin's 40 years ago. Paul's followers have been waiting for the time in which we live to end now for more than 2,000 years. Now, this is not to suggest that Kairos is impossible. There are numerous reasons to think that the protests will result in significant changes to how this country deals with policing. Black Lives Matter, as a movement, now has more support than it ever did before. It has significantly more support than the civil rights movement did back in the 1960s. Instead, it is to suggest that what we do during periods of Chronos determines whether or not we've actually been through a moment of Kairos. When is it truly time that something can be done? The Ferguson protests following Mike Brown's murder seemed to be a period of Kairos. The death of Trayvon Martin appeared to be a moment of Kairos. The civil rights movement seemed to be a time of Kairos. It's probably not coincidental that Tillich published his influential reflections on the subject in the midst of them. There have been several other moments of Kairos in this country's history: the Civil War and the end of chattel slavery, the Reconstruction that followed, just to name 2. And yet, in each instance, the nation's systems of white supremacy have reasserted themselves. Reconstruction was followed by the construction of Jim Crow. The civil rights movement was followed by the construction of the new Jim Crow. The election of the first black president was followed by the election of the most blatant white supremacist populist to occupy the office in over 100 years. You might remember that at the beginning of our program year, I suggested that the task before us as a religious community was to develop the spiritual tools to help us address 3 intertwined crises: the climate emergency, the resurgence of white supremacy, and the global assault on democracy. That was back in September, before the pandemic. Throughout the year, I suggested in a number of sermons that we could best address these goals by cultivating virtues, kinds of character that would lead to new ways of being and transform our institutions. It was an argument, in some sense, about the importance of Chronos for our spiritual lives and social transformation. It was grounded in classical Unitarian theology, with its belief that what we do matters most, and that the purpose of religious community is to nurture our full human potential, what some call the spark of the divine or the likeness of God, and that this work is the work of a lifetime. In the autumn, the congregation engaged in a separate process to create goals for its developmental ministry. When the process began, I had no inkling that I'd be invited to stay on as your developmental minister. At the time, the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, had explicitly forbid such things. And so I did my simple best to simply help facilitate a series of conversations within the congregation about what First Church needed to focus on over the next 5 years to thrive. Ultimately, with the involvement of well over a third of the congregation, the board adopted a series of developmental goals, each organized around a different question. One of these was, how can we increase our diversity as a church and work to dismantle white supremacy? It proved to be a prescient question, and one that will be necessary to answer in the coming weeks, months, and years. If the period of Kairos we are in can transform our Chronos, the way we organize our ordinary lives. Systematic racism, white supremacy, racism, call it what you will, it has been with this country since before its beginning. The question we must ask now, the question which the mayor and Houston City Council seems to be opposed to asking, is will this moment of Kairos be different? Will we work to ensure that actions across the country transform the criminal justice system into a system of public safety? And will Sunday mornings no longer be the most segregated time of the week? Will we take it as an urgent prompt to transform our cities, our institutions, our lives, and the country? Or will this moment of Kairos, this time in which something can be done, pass as so many other moments have passed, with reforms that allow the nation's systems of white supremacy to reassert themselves? Now, obviously, I do not know the answer to those questions, but what I do know is this. Once again, there is an opportunity to transform the world, and the question is, will the peoples of the United States seize it? Amen.
There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in this love. We rest
and justice, built by our courageous choice. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion meet to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We end our ordinary time, our moment of Chronos, our measured hour of worship together with a simple prayer. O Spirit of life, that some of us name God and others call the spark that leaps each to each. Let this be the moment of transformation, the time when the old world, the world ordered by racism and white supremacy, passes away, and a new one in which people everywhere, of every color and language, each recognize that they are part of the great family of all souls. May it be so, and go in peace, go in love. May our lives be a blessing. Amen.
This year, 2 seniors from our youth group are graduating from high school. Erin Prohaska and Aiden Murphy will be honored right after our announcements today with their photos and information. While our church as buildings is closed, our church as people is still meeting, but now online. There are weekly and monthly offerings to keep you connected and engaged with our community. Please join Carol Burris this morning for reflection and sharing via Zoom at 11:30 before you log into our church's annual meeting, also via Zoom at 1 o'clock. All members of the church are encouraged to attend. Wednesday at 2 p.m., Reverend Colin will be hosting his bi-weekly office hour. You are invited to bring your thoughts, comments, and questions to this open discussion time. Join us every Thursday at 2 p.m. for religious education for families. We connect our church family to our UU faith through stories, sharing, songs, and art. Please go to our website, firstuu.org/online-group-meetings for more details. And remember, all times shown are Central Daylight Time.